Hello, this is Kathleen Kinney, and welcome to part 2 of week 1 of Design Fundamentals. We're going to talk about the history of graphic design, then and now. Now let me warn you, this is not the complete history of graphic design. We actually have an entire class that lasts an entire quarter over the history of graphic design. So this is a very fast version where we're just going to hit the high points. So hold on to your seats and let's go. In the beginning, graphic design originated as humans became capable of analyzing their visual environments. Yes, graphic design is that old. Think about it. Communicating through visual pictures and or words. Now, back in the early times of human beings, they didn't have words, but they did have pictures. So humans began creating visual representations to do things such as understand their environment, communicate to others, or record events. For example, the hunt. Yes, cave paintings are some of the first examples of graphic design that we have. Now, there may be older examples of graphic design, but they haven't survived the weather or time. So the oldest ones we have are the cave paintings. And these cave paintings are visual representations of what was going on in these particular humans' lives. As you can see through this, as you can see with this cave painting from France, this is communicating perhaps the game in the area. Now, can we be 100% sure of what they were trying to communicate at that time? No, because of course we weren't there. But we can get a pretty wild guess. We can have a guess as to what it was for. Here's another cave painting, again, of the animals in the area. Could this have been a communication to others as to the game that was available in that area to survive on? Or could it be just a recording of what they caught so they could keep track of how much game that they could procure during certain times of the year so that they could plan and know that it wouldn't starve if they had to preserve certain amounts of game? As time progressed, specifically in Sumerian times, a system of writing developed for the purpose of recording purchases or taxation. Would you like a receipt? Yes, taxes existed even back in the Sumerian times. It is believed that the first representation of a system of writing was to record the contents of clay jugs. Now, that was to prove ownership and also to record ownership for taxation purposes. Now, this was a great leap from cave paintings to Sumerian times, but again, we're just hitting the high points. So this is an example of cuneiform. Now, when writing first came about, it started out as little pictures. Pictures of a man, pictures of a fish, pictures of a fire, pictures of a home, and those pictures represented what they actually were. Well, as time progressed and man embraced this idea of written communication, these pictures evolved into symbols because they wanted to write them faster. They had various methods and they were writing in clay, so mind you, it was time-consuming and laborious anyway, but they wanted to be able to write faster, so they created new instruments to write with, and they modified these pictures down to more of just a very basic graphic representation of what they once were. And eventually these pictures evolved into not necessarily a picture of a fish to represent a fish, but a fish to represent the sound of f, or a sun to represent the sound of s. So these pictures then evolved into phonetic symbols, and from there we get them down to letters. So that's how the whole writing, again, very quickly I just went through it. There's a whole rich history. But that's basically how it came about. In the Middle Ages, words and pictures were used almost exclusively for religious record keeping. Now, this is the irony of this. Man worked for years and years and years to develop an alphabet. And then after they developed the alphabet, what happened was to create written records was very tough. There were a lot of symbols before it got narrowed down to the 26 letters that we're used to in our Western language. And so people had to be very highly trained in order to write something down. Well, as we did this, what happened was more and more people couldn't write or read because it was so hard to produce written materials, and it was so expensive that only the very elite and rich could have anything that was written. So you had a highly illiterate public. So if you want to produce a book of religious teachings, you're going to have to include pictures to kind of tell the story. So as you can see, we kind of went back Started with pictures to communicate. Those evolved into symbols, then evolved into certain shapes, and then evolved into letters. And then it became so evolved, not everybody understood it, so we had to revert back to pictures. I just find that rather ironic. Here's another page from an illuminated manuscript, and they were called illuminated manuscripts, by the way, because they were generally embellished with gold or silver flake, and they actually shone. So this is an example of an illuminated manuscript where they have decorated the page to again further express what is contained in these words. And this is an example of an Islamic manuscript. As you can see, they had different styles throughout the ages as well. And then everything changed at the invention of the printing press. The role of visual artists or designers changed to accommodate a more mercantile economy. It has been said, and I've read this over and over again, that one of man's greatest inventions of all time, even still today, is the invention of the printing press. I cannot tell you how important this was to not only designers, but also to the public. It was the first form of mass communication. Before, only the wealthy had access to anything written. Anything written was also took a very long time and couldn't be changed readily. With the printing press, rather than creating one book that took years to complete, you could create a book in a matter of days. You could create hundreds of pages every day and then bind them into books. This made printed materials cheaper so that more people had access to them. It also gave access to people who wanted to express their knowledge or record history. It gave them a vehicle to do so that wasn't so expensive that they had to hire somebody to actually handwrite it. So it opened up a whole world of communication to mankind with this invention of the printing press. It was in the 15th century, by the way. One of the first commercial things printed on a printing press was Gutenberg's 42-line Bible. Gutenberg is credited with inventing the printing press, although the Chinese had invented a similar type printing press way before Gutenberg. We're talking about 300 BC. It's just that they couldn't find a commercial application or couldn't get it to work as well as Gutenberg's machine. So Gutenberg's first job was to print a quantity of the 42-line Bible. As a side note, he ran out of money before he finished printing the Bibles. The creditors came and took possession of his printing press, went on to build a printing empire, and Gutenberg pretty much was left penniless, even though he created one of man's greatest inventions. It's kind of a sad story. So with the printing press, we have new opportunities. We have books on every subject. We have newspapers. We have posters. We have flyers. We have ways to communicate to the public. Think about the significance of this. Would there have been an American Revolution if we didn't have the printing press? How would those people that were settled in those colonies, who were so far apart and transportation at the time was just by horse, how would they have communicated to one another what is going on if they didn't have the ability to print things and print materials and transport them from one place to another? How would you have gathered a revolution together if you didn't have a way of presenting it to a large group of people? It's tough to create a revolution if you don't communicate with a lot of people, and printing made that a lot easier. It also made it easier to sell things. The industrial age, when we hooked up a steam-powered engine to the printing press, moved the role of the graphic designer from being an independent scholar artist to the increasingly specialized role of visual form giver. Printing presses can now produce thousands of prints per hour. If you these mechanized printing presses, what happened was, before the printing press was mechanized, the owner of the printing press pretty much did everything. They laid out the page, they printed the page, they pulled the page off the printer, and they bound the page. So they pretty much were an artist in themselves, in that they created these printed pieces from the very beginning to the end. Now, when they hooked up these printing presses to steam-powered engines, that all changed. You now split apart the different jobs. You had the printing press operator, you had the graphic designer that laid out the page, you had the person that pulled the pages off at the end of the printing press and bound them, you had binders and cutters. So what we had was the visual form giver, or the graphic designer, became a specialized position. And here's an old ad, which I found interesting, for corsets and for fashionable garments for ladies' wear. But as you can see, as soon as there was a printing press, Pretty soon thereafter, somebody got the idea of, hey, we can use this to sell something. How to Get Rich by Uncle Ben. This is a book cover designed back in the 1800s. And then beginning in the 20th century, graphic design, especially in the U.S., ended up playing a huge role in the development and growth of the consumer society. People caught on. Printing was a way to sell things. It also kind of gave birth to advertising. And advertising is actually just the power of persuasion. Before, people sold things, and they were sold things because they needed them. They needed food, they needed cloth, they needed staples, they need the basic items. Well, with advertising, we could now sell things to people that they really didn't need. Do you really need that soft drink? Do you really need that snack food? Do you really need that really fancy pair of tennis shoes? No. Advertising creates that need. So the power of persuasion was born. We had advertising, packaging, branding, and style making. So if you wanted to be beautiful, you needed to go to the Ellis Stone beauty shop. Do you need to be beautiful? No. Do you want to be beautiful? Well, that's what the advertisers tell us, and they're telling us that we need to look like this, ladies. So I guess we need to go to the Ellis Stone beauty shop. Football is exciting, specifically Notre Dame football. It's an advertisement that you want to go to the games. You want to follow the Notre Dame football team. Interesting, isn't it? And of course, for a beverage. So as you can see, the printing press kind of foisted advertising upon us in a certain, well, actually, it did foist advertising upon us, so we have Gutenberg to thank for that. There was a cross-cultural exchange between the U.S. and Europe that emerged after World War II. European influence was all the rage in American post-war consumer culture. For example, Swiss modernism or pop futurism were two styles that were born of that era. And what we saw with communication and design is now we were crossing cultural borders. We wanted to be like the Europeans after that war. So we adopted some of their design styles. With this ad, you can see the European design style of the way the painting is rendered. It's not a realistic painting. It has more of a Rembrandt feel to it. And then came Vietnam, a war begun by a generation shaped during the Depression and fought by the first full-fledged consumer generation. That was the significance. It was fought by the first full-fledged consumer generation. It was fought by a generation who grew up with advertising, prolific advertising. And they knew that communication was a vehicle to shape societal outlooks, thoughts, feelings, and moods. Graphic language mutated in some instances to a hybrid forms of protest and subcultural dialects. Disestablishmentarianism and make love, not war came out of this. Here's a poster from that era. Make love, not war. So what happened was this generation embraced graphic design to not just advertise something, but to actually try to influence society as a whole. And you got to remember, we were already influencing it through advertising, so why not use it as a vehicle for political influence? And that's exactly what happened. A poster from the Grateful Dead. And as you can see, this design style was completely different from the 19th century. It's very fresh, it's illegible, and very wild. They were trying to break apart or break away from the old style of design and create something all their own. You can hardly read this one, but it's interesting to look at. And there's a poster by Peter Max. This was to celebrate the Apollo venture in 1969. And then technology changed everything. Technology developed during World War II filtered down to the consumer masses. We had a digital revolution on our hands. We had personal computers, video games. Does anyone remember Pong? Computer graphics and movie and television production studios. We had a new visual culture. There were no limits. We weren't limited to just print. We were not limited to just film. We could create all sorts of things in this digital revolution. It opened up a whole new venue for design. Here's a screenshot of Pong, by the way, in case you don't know what that is. It was a very boring video game, but at the time, it was thought to be cutting edge. And I will tell you that I'm old enough to remember having a Pong game and remember playing it for hours on end. And all it was two paddles with a ball that went back and forth and just made sounds like boop, boop. Not real exciting as compared to today's video games. Star Wars was a movie that opened up a whole new venue as far as movie making. It was cutting edge, the way that that whole movie was shot. Even though if you look at those movies today, you think, those effects really aren't that glamorous. But they were at the time. And then came the web. This opened up a whole new frontier for design and communication and visual communication. Now, the web was a computer network created by the American military for post-doomsday survival, and it gave birth to a new decentralized media of the internet. So yes, it was created for military purposes, but we eventually saw the commercial applications. Through the web, a creative culture of specialized producers developed the internet, and which became a required medium for businesses. E-commerce was born. Leave it to the Americans. We find a new way to communicate visually. We're going to find a new way to sell stuff. Because originally the internet was just to exchange information. It was set up for post-doomsday survival, and it also was utilized by universities to trade information. Well, we also figured out how we could use it to sell things. And think about what the internet has done for us today. It has opened up visual communication to basically everyone. If you can get to a computer and to the internet, you can communicate to the world. This is so different than it used to be. It used to be you had to have money. You had to have a good chunk of change in order to create something visually that you could communicate to more than just a couple of people. Today, you can set up blogging in your basement. And that brings us to today, the digital age, which we are all very familiar with. And we now have even more opportunities for visual communication. It doesn't show any signs of slowing down. So the summary of all this, and to understand why we do go over history in this class, is because to know where you are going, you have to know where you've been. Thanks so much, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.